Bonsoir à toutes et à tous. Goedenavond iedereen en welkom. Vanavond hebben Bozar en A+, het genoegen de Britse architect Mary Duggan te mogen verwelkomen. Ze richtte haar bureau op in 2017 in Londen, nadat ze mededirecteur was van Duggan Morris Architects. Haar werk bestaat voornamelijk uit culturele en residentiële gebouwen. Mary Duggan remet en question les conventions établies. Elle réinvente la valeur de chaque projet qu'elle aborde avec une attention conceptuelle méticuleuse. Elle nous présentera entre autres ce soir le Lion Green Road, un projet résidentiel construit au sud de Londres, composé de 157 nouveaux logements répartis en 5 bâtiments sculptés. Ze is lid van het Design Review Panel van de London Borough of Camden en neemt actief deel aan prestigieuze juries. Notre série de conférences internationales 2023 est rendue possible grâce au soutien d'un certain nombre d'organismes que nous tenons à remercier ce soir. Onze sponsor Assa Abloy, onze structurele partner Febelsem en Dieter en Imo, de Vlaamse overheid, la ville de Bruxelles, la région de Bruxelles-Capitale et la Fédération Wallonie-Bruxelles. Je remercie aussi Bozar pour avoir coproduit cet événement avec A+, et je laisse maintenant place à Mary Duggan et vous souhaite une très bonne conférence.
Hello, everyone. I can barely see you, but thank you for the introduction, Lara. I thought I'd start and go straight into a slide to perhaps set the foundations for my talk. This is an image. It's an image of a beautiful landscape. It's Landmannalaugar in Iceland, and it's a place that I visited in 2017. It contains craters, lakes, waterfalls, and volcanoes, and it's very much a geomorphic landscape. And the reason I'm showing it, as I'm sure you've all worked out, is because it lacks the presence of any form of civilization or architectural construction. It's completely untampered with. So what I wanted to do was, whilst you're looking at that, read a quote by Lawrence Durrell from his book The Spirit of Place. He's a travel writer, where he expresses his views on inhabitation. I think this is rather amusing, actually. So he says, there are places where you feel that the inhabitants are not really attending to and interpreting their landscape. Whole peoples or nations sometimes get mixed up and start living at right angles to the land, so to speak, which gives the traveller a weird sense of alienation. And then he goes on to say that there are much simpler things that people are not, in a way that people are not really listening to what the land is saying. So I think really this, as a kind of prelude, it sets out, I suppose, my fascination with landscape, with materiality, and also talks about these sort of two contradictory positions that I have, which is very much related to my occupation, this sort of passion that I have for materials and landscape, but a kind of sadness about the destruction that we cause through the occupation that we have. I decided to compartmentalize the talk, I think for sanity's sake more than anything else. So it looks pink here, but it's a pink slide that breaks the talk into 3 sections. In the first section, which I've called reasoning, I want to talk about my interests, my working methodology, and within that, some kind of explorations that some have and some have not conclusions. And the second section I've called sharing, and this is what I want to talk about is what I did when I set up my new practice and how I explored my particular fields of influence and the working dynamics within my studio. And again, within that section, I want to talk about some projects that have sort of fed into that process. And then finally, I want to conclude with 2 projects. One is Lion Green Road, and another is an installation that I completed at the at the Versailles Biennale in 2022. I think I suspect a lot of you don't know me at all, so I feel before I go into the first slide, I should tell you a bit about myself. I set up my very first practice in 2004, and that was called Duggan Morris Architects, with a kind of very strong idea that I would just be a practitioner and I would run a business and the business would make money and it wouldn't be subsidised by anything else other than the work and the commissions that we won. And I did that for 13 years, and the work was really interesting, but very commercially driven. So many of my clients were commercial developers, whether it was office or clients, and there were lots of cultural projects set within that. But I felt very strongly at a moment in 2017 that I needed to kind of move away and start to look at a much smaller bespoke practice that was very much focused on cultural projects, and also to perhaps push back against this notion of iteration and this world that I think we all exist in because of the methodology that we have to apply to our working process, where much of the time you're talking about designs and evidencing why you shouldn't pursue a certain design rather than kind of really working on the project that you feel that you need to deliver. So this first slide is a diagram that I drew to explain to a client who I am in some ways and why I wanted to procure a project in a particular way. So on one level, this talks about what we do in our profession. So there's a route. So we start considering a brief with materials and we progress along a journey to deliver a piece of architecture or a building. So I've kind of reduced these two forms, which you'll understand why when I get to the last project, to get from a boulder to a building. So on one level, we operate a journey as architects where a boulder is collected from a quarry, it's manufactured into a building, and it's kind of as simple as that. And then I describe that as a fairly kind of numb route, not because I don't think it's right, but because I don't think it does the things that I want to talk about. So it's a kind of my counter process to that is one that I describe as a compassionate route, and it's very much what I want to do is talk about materials and process, because I have a very kind of deep belief in making and the action of making and the levels of interaction that are involved in a kind of manufacturing a building. And that involves layers of participation. And I think by stretching out that process, like quite literally talking about it, exploring it and making models, that you somehow embed a kind of deeper understanding of the project, the conceptual status of the project, and therefore moving forward, there's an implied understanding of the fact that that project will move forward, it will patternate, and it will start to form memories within the future. This is another drawing that I really like. It was presented to me recently. I was part of a symposium in Denmark, and it's a drawing by William Rhys Moorish, and it's a drawing taken from his book Civilizing Terrains. The image on the top is obviously talking about the pyramids, and the image on the bottom kind of more contemporary structures that are kind of set within kind of more cities. It's a diagram that talks more about urbanization. And of course that we know the pyramids is a sacred structure, and it was curated relative to a landscape, and the more contemporary structures described in the lower diagram are not. They're more to do with an accumulation of construction. So the diagrams, there's two things that really interest me. One is the fact that it describes the erasure, the very fact that material is taken from somewhere to make another, and sometimes that is visible and other times it isn't. But also the dotted line that links the two. I think that what I liked about this image is that there's something in the dotted line that I think we need to be talking about. You know, we need to be looking more closely at materials and renovation and how we get materials from A to B. And somewhere in that, for me, is a design process that I want to, through my work, start to talk about as a building aesthetic, or will lead to a building aesthetic. Then I think I'm really fascinated by artworks. You know, there's always, the most architects often reference art, and the obvious difference is art is permanent, it's immovable. And architecture, art cannot be destructed in some sense, even though these two artists, Gordon Matta Clark and Egon Schiele, are depicting ruins here. But they are kind of fixed in time and provide this really interesting reference point. Architecture isn't that. Architecture is mobile and it's constantly changing and affected. But the second thing that interests me is just the notion that we look at art and we draw within our profession, and there's a point at which you'll talk and start to model, much like a child will pick up a paintbrush and start splodging, and that's those splodges in the paint are material and texture and thickness. And then other times you'll pick up a pencil and you might draw another Egon Schiele reference, but a window or a roof tile or something. And in that world, you're talking about object qualities and levels of interaction that are very much about, you know, how you interact as a human being and the object quality that sits in front of you. The image on the left is Fred Sandbanks sitting in an installation, which is sort of the beginning of a string installation. But there's this sort of very simple notion here that we move quite leanly and fluidly between these two conditions. You won't be surprised, I'm sure, to see an image of Morandi. I really try not to talk about him, but I'm just so fascinated. More recently, actually, when I discovered how he worked and what his drawings, I'll flick forward, so what these beautiful still life drawings are about. Because he lived in Bologna all his life with his sisters. So this is an image of his studio, the bed that he slept in. And this is a kind of partition where he would set out the artifacts that he'd collected from local markets in Italy in various configurations and draw them. But what I hadn't realized was that there's a kind of one collection, and they're reconfigured, and sometimes within the paintings they're moved around. So what he's actually drawing is kind of what's in his, what is sort of sights and sounds and smells, with an awareness of the rhythms and the colours within a kind of very confined space. So I think there's a really incredible kind of circularity within that, and one that I hadn't realised, that actually he's drawing something which isn't necessarily about the objects, but about the hues and the colours and the conditions between them through these tools. So that these pieces are his apparatus from which he explores these different conditions. That was a very long-winded way of describing something. So the way I work, if I was to try and summarise it, so these are a series of projects that have come out of my office in the last, I would say, 5 to 7 years. And I really believe in intuition, actually, and a kind of material intuition. So what I often do at the beginning of a project is talk quite extensively about the weight of a building, what materials we'll start to investigate, the life of the building. And I believe that, you know, after years of education and experience, most architects should be able to do that and pursue that. So the occupation concerned with developing a brief should be, this is my first answer, and I'm going to try and get the project to a point where I can prove and evidence that. And then what I do within that process is design a conceptual model, and that conceptual model, so just taking the project on the top left, This is actually a playground structure. It's one of a series of playground structures. The semicircle on the bottom is a low bench, and the raised semicircle is an acoustic partition. And the idea was that these structures would be set within a playground. We didn't really, there were a few CGIs, but what I wanted to explain to my client and what I wanted to really drill into within the studio was an understanding about what this product would be. And in doing that, how you'd make it. So there was a very expansive exercise looking at the ingredients, which was a green pigmented concrete, with some pieces that were gathered locally, some broken bricks and various pieces that were then embedded into this piece. And then they were made. A negative was made, a positive was made, and slowly a kind of degree of accuracy was added to this piece. That's obviously at scale. And then finally, there was a kind of moment where we decided we needed to belt sand it to expose these aggregated pieces, these fossilized pieces. And that was really to describe to our client that this project would patinate over time. And we were able, so most of those models are kind of hand size, kind of the size of a cake box. And I really love this idea that you can describe a process, or a client might witness a process. You witness and really get stuck into building something with a kind of obsessing over the material quality and the making detail, and you can present that to a client as part and parcel of a process of delivering a kind of benchmark piece that would serve as a kind of conceptual mark, a mark in the sand, if you like, for a project moving forward. But then also, going back to this earlier diagram, which is, this idea of erasure, or this idea of the work that you actually have to put in to get a product out of the ground and built. There was these other pieces that belonged to this same structure that were representative of that process. This is another drawing taken from Tim Ingalls, the social anthropologist at Edinburgh University. It's taken from his book called Making, and he talks about the flow of consciousness and the flow of materials. So this is a diagram. I won't read the paragraph because it's too long, but he talks about sort of two lines of movement. One is this idea that there's light quality, there's smells, there's feelings. That's one kind of line of movement. And then on the other side, there's the flow of materials, and that's materials that patinate, that change over a period of time. And he has this lovely description in the book where he says, if you just take two blobs and join them together, you'd capture an image, let's call it a memory, and that would link directly to an object. He also talks about this idea that you might be in a forest, walking through a forest, enjoying the sights and smells and light quality, and you might be in your architectural, beautifully laid out living room, sitting alongside a Danish piece of furniture, but you won't necessarily make the connection between the wood in the forest and the timber on the chair. So I suppose what I'm trying to get to through these explorations is to understand what that line is, and to consider that maybe somewhere in that line, the connections between the sort of flow of consciousness and the materiality of things could come together and start to inform a kind of architectural aesthetic. So perhaps taking that literally, this is a scheme that we designed in Somerset. I'll talk a tiny bit more about it later. It was a typology that I'm sure you, as architects you'll all recognise, and it was about establishing a large central hallway off which a series of rooms, a library, bedrooms, etc., kitchen area and terraces would flow. And that very much came from this idea that, the idea of a boulder and sort of very natural objects and how they kind of sit together and assemble. This is an image of the South Downs, which is with broken rocks sitting on the beachfront. And then developing that forward, we then became interested. So this client was very interested in kind of agricultural buildings. And our view was, well, we're building a new building. There isn't one there. Actually, we think we should be looking at the ground and the geology, and we think the architecture should perhaps be informed by those textures. So what we started to do was understand more about the area. This is a map of Somerset with all the different types of stones that are quarried in the local area. And we had an idea that we would collect those stones, which would then inform a kind of procurement or methodology for building, the facades of the building. So this is a marbling texture that we invented, where material was collected, the shutters were filled, and so on and so forth. And then this is another project located within a kind of Victorian, fairly densely packed, but nonetheless in the country, school site, with lots of A-frame structures sitting in perpendicular orientation to each other. So we designed a building that would respond very deliberately to that. But it sat adjacent to a greenbelt area with this kind of lovely forest of cherry blossoms. So we started to... So within the poured concrete building, that unbelievably, actually, we managed to get through planning within 8 weeks. We started to imagine a datum line which was struck against a series of bark offcuts from these trees within the local forest. And then finally, within this series, this is a project that was just taken from a text. So we were invited to take part in an exhibition to depict one of the cities within Calvino's Invisible City, and we were given Euphemia. And we decided as a studio that we would read the text, converse about the text, reread the text, and consider the materials and the implications within it. And from that text, we developed a piece. The text describes the 7 nations coming together and discussing commerce. It describes the exchange of materials and seeds and poppy seeds and cinnamon and various other materials. So we talk very much about an idea of finding a way of constructing and binding these materials into a single form. And we settled on 2 forms, 2 reciprocal forms. One was this tall column made of cardamom, made of seeds and various spices, very carefully constructed. And the other reciprocal vessel was a cast concrete, which was representative of the 7 nations, but the volume of the column itself, in its kind of wax melted state, would fill the concentric circles at the bottom. So it had this kind of idea of a kind of amphitheatre at the base. And then we agonised how we would wrap and send this piece off to the event's organisers. So gold parchment was referenced in the text. So then, sort of moving between this idea of objects, materials and architecture, one part of my practice, there's an obsession about the materials, the ingredients are often specified, the making process is very much explored and very much part of a kind of participatory exercise within the studio, including the client, actually, or the client would witness it, not necessarily take part. But I quite enjoy the idea that you might... these mock-ups which take objects, place architecture, but place very recognisable pieces within them, because I think you have a very different reading. You need to be told this is a piece of architecture. So this is a floating restaurant within a castle in the Midlands, which actually pre-pandemic, so we didn't execute it, but we got very far down the line. But the process and engagement with the client was very immersive, so we made this wax piece, which was intent and sort of looking at the fluidity of the water. So we made a kind of black wax lake. We looked at the lightness of the structure itself because we wanted it to float, and we wanted to kind of have this very immersive exercise within the office where we actually made the structure and considered the way that we might interact, and then how those interactions might lead us into a different kind of specification or different thoughts about how one might specify the components. And this is the kind of assemblage of all of those pieces, the structure in the centre, the wax lake with very particular kind of workings within it, and the mimosa tree that surrounded the site. So the presentation to the client was a combination of objects, real architectural components, and the kind of more kind of sensory or emotive pieces that are taken from the site. So that wasn't the last in the series, actually. So this is an exhibition that we completed for the Barbican in 2018. It was an exhibition where we were invited to design a structure that could host 333 artworks by Dorothea Lange. She was an American documentary photographer, very well known for documenting the American Depression period and the plight of the refugees as they kind of moved around in search of new homes. So I suppose, presented with the opportunity to design an exhibition, on one level you could kind of divorce yourself from the artworks, but we became very interested in, the meaning embedded within the artworks, and we wanted to think about a structure that could evoke a mood that was directly associated with the contents of the imagery. So this one on the left is this kind of lovely image of the entire contents of a home, a kind of rolled up piece of vinyl waiting to be reassembled somewhere else. And then these are images. The image on the left is a made-up home of kind of found pieces. So what we wanted to do was somehow sort of emulate that environment through the contents and the material quality within the show. So this is obviously an image of it under construction on the right, and you can see the kind of resonance between the photograph and the installation. And then what we discovered when we kind of delved a bit deeper, and we worked with the curators, and the decision was to curate her working life from how she started her career, which was as a kind of portrait photographer working for kind of the very wealthy. That we'd start the exhibition with this very contained space, and as you move through the exhibition framework would start to dematerialize, and the pieces would start to expose as you move from one gallery to the next. And these are pieces of that exhibition. The image on the left it displays her first portraiture work with an opening on the right, which is a kind of very literal explanation in some ways of her great epiphany moment, where she decides she wants to kind of go out into a kind of or enter into a more difficult life and start to talk about the Depression. This is a project that I worked on from 2008 to almost the present day. And the reason for that is that it's the original site I purchased personally, and I constructed a house for myself. And I think most architects want to do that, and you imagine what this beautiful house would be should you ever get this opportunity. And I was very lucky to be presented with this opportunity. But the house that I'd imagined I would do, being an architect and sort of kind of processing that over and over again, really wasn't the house that I built. And that had a lot to do with the site. But what I discovered with this project was, perhaps my own kind of reservations. But actually the site that I bought was a backland plot, if you can keep that image in your head, and surrounded by Victorian garden walls, and it had been unoccupied for 25 to 30 years. So the site itself is this L-shaped section in the middle. And this is a depiction just of the gardens. So the L-shape was completely empty. It had operated as an old plastering yard, and the small pieces coming in at the top and the bottom are the gardens from Victorian dwellings that were slung at 90 degrees to the site. So very much in the UK we call those backland plots. a site that very much needed to be developed. But what was really beautiful about it, I'm sorry, I need to go back, was that just the fact that it had this amazing texture, which was kind of a combination of masonry, brick, and concrete, and it had been completely self-seeded, covered in Virginia creepers and all sorts of plant life, and it had this really beautiful textural quality. So the decision that I made was that that needed to be kept. So this is the area, this is the kind of nollie as an overlay, and you can see the kind of brick walls surrounding it. So the decision was a rather quick one, actually, which was to insert 2 new lines, allow the site to kind of be itself, be what it already was, and to place the house between those 2 brick walls. And then later, so this is the way the story goes. It's sort of quite an unusual one. I lived in the house for 4 years, and I sold the house to a friend. And then that friend put the house back on the market because he was moving to Copenhagen. And I had a client that I was designing another house for, and he had been to the house, and the reason that he commissioned me was because he'd visited the house and loved it. He said, "I want you to design this other house for me." And then when he realised this was back in the market, he decided he wanted to buy it. So it was really quite emotional because I had to go back. I thought I'd said goodbye to it, and I had to kind of go back in and think about what the next stage was. But obviously I knew so much about the plot. So these are images of the first phase of the house. And you can see that it was a very simple decision to extend the brick walls. Because it was slung at 90 degrees, he had this kind of really lovely kind of scene at the rear of the house, which looks over a kind of number of back gardens belonging to individuals. So it was almost like a stage set that changed throughout the seasons. And then this is a very kind of architectural photograph which describes the kind of interior brick walls that extend outwards, which are completely consumed with climbers. So what we did to make sure that happened, we added a particular sand grain into the mortar because we knew that certain creepers would use that as an armature. And this is kind of it, not photographs that I'm particularly proud of, but it was a really lovely place to be in and to witness the seasonal change, the change in the colour of the Virginia creepers, but also to see that the building really acting as an armature could host the garden and be very subservient to the garden. So then the next phase was also a weird moment because I felt that I knew exactly where the house needed to go because I knew where the plants in the garden grew and where they didn't grow, and there was a dark spot at the back of the plot next to the studio where nothing would survive. And the materiality, or the decisions around the materiality, were already made. So that's the first phase on the left and the second phase on the right. And it had to do some, quite clever, but not really clever strategic things. There was a very long laneway. Sorry, I'll point with... So that's the street front, and the Victorian buildings are coming in this way. And there's a very long laneway that needed to lead into the main house because the studio needed to be subservient to the main house. So we fairly quickly decided that curvature would would lead to the front door, but there would be a secondary means to just step into the studio. And then there was another entrance at this end. And that was kind of it, designed kind of literally in a day. It's just what it needed to be because I had this kind of insight into how the plot of land functioned. And then the drawings, I could draw with, some authority because we knew what the specification was and we knew the creepers to specify and that we wanted to describe, in some ways, a kind of ruin, and working backwards from this idea that the building would slowly be consumed by the garden and the plant life surrounding it. So these are the drawings that we described that were very much focused on the life of the garden. And then as we progressed, the project, as a brief, sort of turned into a kind of cave, and we divorced the interior programme from the exterior programme once that was established. So we went through a process of building a model, designing roof lights in very particular positions alongside our clients. So a roof light that would sit over a grand piano or a sampling space, and some other roof lights that would sit over kind of positions for working desks. And again, the specification was very simple within it. It was just clay walls, a very robust concrete floor with some pieces that were broken and sanded into it. And then very tiny gestures. This is a handrail. I kind of think it looks rather like a sort of morphed flute that was designed to take coats and support the hand on access into the building. Virtually nothing inside it, a very small shelf to support guitars and various musical instruments. But all the pieces very much focused on looking out and bringing into the garden and bringing light in from the top. And so this is it from the outside. This is it kind of more or less on day of completion, a beautiful garden designed by Non Morris. And this is it sort of slowly being consumed by this landscape. So then once we got to the point that everything was built, we understood what the entire specification would be. We became obsessed with the door handle because we thought, well, the door handle is the last thing that's left. The door handle is the component that allows you in and out. It's only the only piece left to interact with. And talked at great length about the stones we would use. So these are two salvage pieces of stones. The green section at the top was the pull section. So we kind of worked towards an idea that you'd always sort of pull the door and there'd be a pressure on your hand. There were numerous plasticine models that sort of tried to consolidate the decision around that action. And then on the opposite side, the egg shape was this piece that we placed on the inner side that you'd sort of push and exit the building. And that's it in situ. So the next section, I really wanted to talk about what I did when I set up my new practice. And the idea really was sparked by a project that I had completed in my first practice, which was to design an entrance or a threshold pavilion for the Saatchi Gallery just on King's Road. Actually, it was a competition entry, which we didn't win. But in sort of trying to process, we knew the brief was a brief that you would imagine it needed to provide a cafe service, a space for young artists to exhibit, and the potential to operate and host events. But we decided that rather than iterate options for a program, because as you know with competitions, you're always working without a client, so there's always a bit of a gamble. What we decided we'd do is engage in a dialogue with 3 different artists and to try and allow those artists to inform the building program. So the first artist that we spoke to was Angela de la Cruz, an amazing Spanish sculptor. And it is a coincidence, but perhaps it isn't a coincidence, that the design of the pavilion had this sort of crumpled form. And the image on the left is entitled Big Canvas, and it's a canvas, a giant canvas that's crumpled and sits within a gallery space. But what we actually talked extensively to her about was she was at a moment where she was designing these pieces, which started out as Judd-like, I suppose, aluminium boxes that she was then kind of deforming to her specification to try and find sort of familiar shapes. And then in addition to that, she was actually designing a surface treatment. And I don't know what the ingredients were, but they had this incredible quality, which is impossible to see here, where you kind of look from a distance and you would imagine it was something, and you'll all imagine something. But the closer you get, the more kind of pigmentation you see in the surface of the structure itself, in the materiality. So we talked to her about actually being part of the design process where she would help to specify the ingredients for this building, which we imagine would be a poured structure, and there would be a reading of it from a distant reading from a particular perspective, but also a different understanding of it, perhaps the kind of visibility or materiality of some fossilized pieces when you were much closer to it. Then the next artist was Germaine Kruip. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, but this is a piece that she had just made for Frieze. And it was a digital installation whereby the presence of someone walking through it was captured and replayed in sort of the wrong place. So it was neither shadow nor a kind of transition moment. So you're very aware that you were walking through the space. But that provoked a discussion around thresholds, and this position we took that came out of that was this sort of relative position of the a discussion around where you understand you entered the building, where the front door was and where the glazed screens were, and what this space could actually host. And then the final one was we spoke to Peter Liversidge. He does works in lots of different media, but he had a series of works which are these sort of typewritten pieces. He uses a very old-fashioned typewriter to write a prediction about a project and project the project into the future. So he was able to sort of describe a building which was actually a moment in time, a competition entry, but perhaps give it a kind of a life through this presentation of an artwork, which I think, for us was a very different thing to talking about a building in the future. When you talk and present something from an artist who has a particular attitude about time, it certainly had a greater resonance with this client. So I suppose my thinking was from that, taking that forward, I think we work in a very closed loop, actually, very knowledgeable. We interact with consultants. We talk about all sorts of things, engineering, whatever, lots of technical inputs and lots of concerns. But I felt and I feel that there is a very closed knowledge loop with nothing kind of coming in and influencing from the outside. So what I decided to do was sort of liberate that, so sort of turn the diagram the other way around and open up my studio and allow different kind of fields of influence in. So I decided to set up a residency program, and I've had 4 so far, stopped just at the beginning of the pandemic. And what I wanted to do was not collaborate, because I don't actually really understand what you get out of a collaboration other than 2 people working together towards a kind of compromise solution. What I wanted to do was open up the studio to a new occupant who might perhaps change the dynamic within the studio. So the first person who engaged with us was a ceramicist called Cara Guthrie. She was actually the sister of one of my employees at the time. And she came in, set up a potting wheel. She was booked in lots of kilns for firing and glazing for a 3-month period. And she just did her own work, which was highly productive, pots after pots on crates, and then off they went to be fired. And then in this sort of parallel working pattern that we'd established together, so it was amazing for us just to see a production line, zooming in and out of MicroStation or whatever CAD, angry phone calls to a contractor, really quite slow and sometimes monotonous. And she was just going and going, and the rhythm and the sounds and the smell of the clay was kind of really unusual and really, really inspiring. So we had this moment. The image on the right is the Aviaries, a project I talked about earlier, which is this piece of geology, reference boulders. We were working through that project. She, at the same time, she went to the site, beautiful site. She camped on the site. She gathered organic material, And she developed this sort of marble glaze for one of the vessels that she was making, whilst we were developing this sort of marble structure from materials we'd gathered from local quarries. So completely independent work, ours and hers, but actually both informed by each other's working processes. And this was another piece that she made, a very similar typology for a backland site, a series of structures, themed rooms. It's a project that's under construction at the moment. She's just designed a series of ceramic caddies that could sit in kind of unison in an ensemble, or could break away and settle within each room within this building. And then the final resident was Benjamin Tassie. He joined the office at a composer, not the composer that I designed the extension to the house with, but he's a musical composer, works in a range of different media, and he joined the office whilst we were working on this listed structure in the city. This is a reflected ceiling plan on the left, and one of its iterations in the early 18th century. We were having a very slow, iterative discussion with the conservation team within the city, and that conversation, which I'm sure you'll be familiar with, involved breaking down the building, because it was Grade 2 listed, into the parts that we might be able to really interface with and change, and other parts that we had to absolutely do not touch, put them on ice. They need to be either reinstated or left as found. Very, very slow. And this was our response to that, or some of the images, which, you know, I'm more than pleased with. So the image on the right is a bay window, which is basically very simply refurbished. And then the image on the left is the part of the building that we were allowed to renovate, and we were allowed a greater deal of intervention. So we just looked at the kind of ergonomics of the bay window and tried to replay that through the form of this lobby, which allows a person to sort of step within the pleat of the lobby. And then similarly within the rooms, actually a very complex project. It's essentially a domestic building that we were converting into a commercial property. And what we had to do was invent ways to hide surfaces. So the image on the right is in one of the kind of do not touch, put it on ice listed floors. We developed these really giant kind of Victorian cabinets, these very numb cabinets. And what actually happens with these is air goes in the bottom and it comes out of the top, but they're intended to be these kind of loose furniture-like objects. And then the equivocal contemporary version was allowed on the upper floors. So what he did, going back to the resident, whilst all of that was going on, very expansive conversations, which, some of the arguments were, shall we reinstate the cornice, or can we just leave it out and paint a ghost profile in? So we got our way with some things. But what he did was the building had a bell, it had a belfry and a beautiful tower room. He collected all of the data, so he rang the bell and digitized it. He took some sounds from the construction work. He researched extensively the history of the building, and he amalgamated it into a musical piece, which included soprano voices and some of the Baroque instruments that he discovered that were being played during the period of the occupation of this building. And all I can say is it was the most beautiful 15 minutes sitting in a tower room, listening to a sound, which I can only say kind of sounded like history. Then the last resident that came in was an illustrator called Nigel Peake, a kind of really wonderful character. He decided he didn't want to be seen, so we constructed a space within a cupboard, actually, with a window. But what he wanted to do was sit and just observe the office, listen to the sounds, the discussions, observe the samples and the pieces that were kind of moved in and out of the office. This is the kind of stain, I suppose, that he left on the table after he'd completed the work. So what he did, he made 10 lovely drawings, more than 10 actually, but we consolidated it in a book, which was 10 drawings, which were representative of his time within the practice, so looking at various pieces, listening to conversations about colour and light quality and the like. And these are so beautiful, not really... it's very difficult to see the kind of quality and the intensity of these drawings. Each drawing contains 7 to 8 layers of pencil work in different orientations to generate different rhythms. We decided that for this dialogue to actually start to inform the practice in some ways, that each of us would take one of these drawings and we would make something three-dimensional. The only rule being that it would need to be cast, it would need to start as liquid and become solid. So the first one was this drawing was taken and very simply converted into this triptych of triangulated forms. The second was the architect who took this one on. And actually, I should say, it was really hard to persuade everyone to do it because we're so used to working with a brief and iterating and breaking down area schedules and drawing into plans. To get an architect to actually freeform was a difficult thing. You know, also for me, because I did one. So this architect took his reading, and he suspected it was a depiction of a facade that we were working on in the office. So he kind of expanded it and contracted it and made these two lovely cast pieces, one with kind of vertical extrusion and one a kind of elongated. And this was my one, which I was less interested in the kind of form that it would imply, rather the material quality. And it reminded me of, so this is a very simple piece that I made, but it reminded me very much of a kind of beach that I go to a lot in Devon, which has this sort of beautiful pink, green and black rock in this sort of pleated form. You know, the science and the kind of geography that sort of goes into this to make these forms is something that we really never get to fully understand, you know, unless you cut a surface off a quarry and bond it to a building. It's not really something that you get to engage with because we're very much forced to follow the laws of gravity. So I designed a kind of shuttering piece that would enable me to pour wax at a datum and then turn the model back into a horizontal datum to sort of emulate this material quality. And these are all the pieces resulting from that residency. Finally, I wanted to talk about two projects. One is very big, and I'll kind of work through. Hopefully what you'll see is that I'm not mad, that it isn't all kind of baking and making and kind of materiality. It's actually quite difficult to find the right words to describe how I work and what I do and what my beliefs are, because most things in architecture are very technical and very tangible, and they're about numbers and engineering. And I think what I do perhaps isn't that. This is a scheme located in the London Borough of Croydon. We were commissioned to develop 100 houses, and we actually in the end developed 157 houses. And those houses needed to rest in this kind of unusual site. You know, I'm from London. I tend to work in very urban plots. This one is suburban, and it was part and parcel of a kind of larger, not a master plan, but a wider landscape that was undergoing some quite extensive development. The most significant one was to the south, this sort of long tail of 600 units that were being developed to the south of it. This is our plot, which is roughly 100 metre by 100 metres square. And all the area at the top is very much suburbia, so 2-storey houses, clay brick roofs, combination of brick and white render. And then all the way down here is sort of light industrial, and there's a town centre very close to it, but very much a kind of suburban town centre. And there are all those components zoomed in. What was kind of really good for us is that at the back of the site is a scheduled ancient monument which was raised some 8 metres higher than the roadside. And this huge expansive area of retained open land, as in you cannot be built upon, beautiful piece of land. And this was the greenbelt when we arrived, which was then subsequently developed into the 600 homes. So the challenge, and this is, as you've seen, the kind of the final figure, which is nothing like what the client had expected. They had expected that we'd take this sort of suburban geometry and model and maybe sort of extrude into the site. And we obviously did iterate at this point to prove that actually if we were to build a series of pavilions, we could raise those pavilions higher, but more importantly, preserve the ground, more of the ground in between, and allow the public to rest and profit from that space, and keep that space open and allow that, enable pathways through it into the open land at the rear. And this is the scene taken, if I go back, from the kind of higher ground, looking back towards the plot, and the site itself sits somewhere in here. So a kind of quite interesting landscape, much like this Egon Schiele painting, where neither the landscape or the housing has a particular hierarchy. And what we became interested in is perhaps kind of retaining as much of the green, as much of the trees that were there in a lovely bluebell woods, rather than sort of flattening the lot and building in lots of hard standing with perhaps new landscaping, but rather something that would perhaps retain this sort of balance of building and green. I think some of these Egon Schiele paintings, this is his painting series of old buildings, they are rather melancholic, and what he did was he would go up ladders and sort of draw these images of these townscapes from the top, so he was always looking down upon them. And this is another image that I kind of really enjoyed, which is, again, it's a photograph of a ruin, but I became interested in how the green in the ground and the kind of pixelated quality was almost the same as the ruin itself. And I allowed that to lead this process, which was to try and find the balance between the softscape and the hardscape, and I mean the architecture, and understand a bit more about how we might start to describe the architecture and the green working together, and then how those connections between the pavilions might start to work and be imagined as these sort of carved pathways between the buildings. So there are 5 of them, set out in this kind of dice shape. They are all actually the same, apart from the chamfer from a few of them. So the image, you can see that they're all identical. They just turn in radius, and one is reflected. And the cuts off of them, one is designed to enable a very large tree canopy to fit. This one is lower at the front to be polite to the very low building across the street. And this one is cut to open up views to this scheduled monument, which is one of the only remaining pieces of the Surrey Iron Railway in the UK. But it's actually just a mound with a bunch of trees on it. So this is it in its setting. So you can see each front door has a very kind of casual relationship to the next. Those are the actual old and new trees. And you can see here how the section 8 meters east, west, north and south really, really helped us. Because what we decided to do was to take each pavilion and just drop them into the ground and sit them at the topology with some adjustment in a position that the ground dictated, and then split the section at ground from the entrance through the lobby and ascending towards the back of the site. And that's it in different positions. I mean, I would say it's housing and it's very, very tight budget. So I suppose we work really hard with the materials, but more often than not, some of the iterations were kind of deleted off the spreadsheet. But we managed to get to the point where we had a pixelated, really simple structure, which would also at some point serve as a kind of armature for the landscape. But the real win here was to look at the typology and at the ground condition and give the ground condition back to the public. So the area is, actually I'll move on to the next slide. That's the 100 metre, approximately 100 metre plot. this is how the tenure is designated. So it is tenure blind. There's a series of tenants moving in, probably block by block. And what I think is going to be really amazing about that is each block is designed with its own domestic terrace. So you access it from a public garden, you move through a public garden, through a public private zone, and I can describe how that's achieved. Then you move up a ramp and you land on a residence terrace, which is all open. The only reason you descend the ramp is if you're a resident. So you get to a residential level, and then the plans are arranged so you move through the buildings from front to back. So you're constantly moving through the landscape. The plan is engineered to enable that to happen. And that's just a description. So it is the same, I promise you, the same plan. One is handed, and the rest are just turned within the ground with the section adjusted to meet the ground. And perhaps, maybe a stretch here, but sort of just to talk about the layers. This is the basic plot with the trees that were retained, large trees that were retained, the trees that were then added, the green plot that we figured out we could build within in consideration of the kind of neighbourly offsets, the pathways that are fully accessible that would allow us through, the building plots themselves, these raised terrace that you ascend into, and then these routes through the building. So they were designed with lobbies and front doors, with bike racks and small sheds so that residents can look after the gardens. There are a series of allotments distributed across it. But bins and other services were located at the back, so you would always have to navigate through the landscape into your private terrace, into the garden shed, and then move through as you were exiting to dispense with your rubbish. So we thought very hard about the sort of practical things and the reason why you would kind of have to occupy the entire site. And these are those service zones, and these are the units as it develops to the upper level. So maybe going back to the kind of erasure slide at the very beginning, I really like what it has done to the ground typology. These are the shapes that are carved into the ground as a result of the construction, which just spring off the existing typology, rather than something that just scrapes the ground completely and is built from scratch. So this explains the public realm, the ascent into the terrace at the top. So that's public garden. You ascend a ramp, you go in, this is the front door, and then you descend, you'd exit at the back, at the raised level within the garden, so you're constantly sort of moving through the site topography. So it was really important to us that as this was a scheme that saves landscape and gifts landscape to the public and allows the residents to kind of fully engage with it and to develop this community, it was important that you re-engage with the landscape. So every single, within the plan, sorry, that's the slide that just to kind of make the point, it's quite difficult to describe. So the way, because I know what you're all thinking, because you're architects, how does it work here? So you ascend, this is the private terrace, this is a public garden, you can move through up the stairs and out the back and put your bins away, and off you go into the open land to walk your dog or whatever you're doing. But because there's a section split here, this unit is raised some distance off the ground. This is all open space and public garden, but we introduce some kind of defensible rough planting, just not rough, but planting, so that the public wouldn't move in close to this line. But nonetheless, there's this significant section difference between this unit and the ground plane. And that's sort of further explained. So that's public, residence terrace, and you move through to the back with this, with the services on the rear side. So there's this sort of transition from public, semi-public, back to public again. So 3 plans, really simple. You went main front door, residence terrace, through to a lobby. So you go up and then you go through to the back. And then on the upper floors, the shared lobbies, there's 6 units per core with these corner balconies that look out and give you these 360-degree views of the surrounding landscape. And that's the cut-back section with the shared terrace. And it was very logical, it really was, and it was agonising discussions with QSs and contractors in the end to really present that actually each building facet has a 90-degree angle, which is repeated around the structure, with these balconies that are 6 of them, always sitting on the corner, exactly the same shape per unit. And these are the balconies with the kind of this detail, so this obsession and this. So my future image for this building is that the residents look after the ground, and that is facilitated by garden sheds, by allotments, by beautiful bluebell woods and play areas. So they're really engaging, and the terrace that is shared within each block, that they start to that they do re-engage at balcony level, and these balconies are designed with these bulges at the base, so you can push pots into the base of them, and hopefully in time they will become greens too. And these are some quite nice construction images of describing how those corner balconies sort of push into the tree canopies. And within this is just a final, actually there's one project after this, sorry, a series of images that are really just trying to capture the building amongst the green and describe these kind of lovely routeways that move through the buildings. The buildings are actually quite organic. The material has grown, the planting has grown quite extensively now. This is taken just as the project is completed. And because of the height and the distance between, you get these lovely moments where the buildings sort of close up, they're very close together, and it feels very domestic, and then they part again, and you get the sight lines through to the landscape beyond. And then these sort of, it's just there, it's in the background from the raised suburban position. It feels very much like a subservient structure, even though it ranges from 5 to 9 stories across the plots. But this is my favourite image, and it's an image where you don't see it. The building is in there, it's completely consumed within this tree canopy, and we've preserved this kind of lovely suburban image of the kind of clay roof tiles and white render. So just one final project that I wanted to talk about, which is a small pavilion. I think I can call it a pavilion. Well, I have. Designed for the Versailles Biennale. The theme for the Biennale was essentially the global climate emergency, the crisis that we find ourselves in. And the challenge that I was presented with was to construct one of 4 pavilions within the listed courtyard at the front of the university using plaster of Paris, a material kind of prevalent within the area, and wood. So the way I decided to approach that was to think about procurement in this kind of wider context, and the struggles we're now having with material reuse, renovation, kind of redeployment of material. And I think what we do as architects and what we've been doing historically is, in causing this extensive damage, not the sole reason, but we have been quite greedy. And I think the way we procure is very greedy, because we've kind of inherited this process, this kind of iterative process, whereby you consider material after material. You start off a project and you think, oh, well, I can build it out of anything. And I'll speak to my QS and he'll tell me what's the cheapest. And I'll speak to my engineer and he'll say concrete, hybrid, timber, whatever I can choose. So I decided that we can't do that. And maybe this is an opportunity, theoretically, to consider what would happen if you don't or if you can't. So this is a kind of iterative, the amalgamation, or that's the way I saw it. And what I wanted to operate, and I was a bit scared, but I decided I was going to do it if this experiment and the commitment to it was going to mean anything, was to run a kind of linear process whereby we're presented with a material, let's call it the only material that was available, or this material might be a ruin, and you'd work with it, you'd make it work as hard as you could according to a theoretical program, and then you'd find other materials to add to it, to reinforce it. So I actually gave this a title which I really quite like. It's called For the Love of Materials, a pavilion made of gypsum, then stone, then wood, because that describes what we actually did. And that's something that you just don't do in architecture. Everything has to be very clearly specified and programmed and diagrammed and tendered and all of those things. But this was like, we're going to start here, we're going to keep going, and let's see what the outcome is. And I suppose with the objective, or my written objective, was let's see what this looks like. Does this lead us to a different kind of aesthetic? And what am I designing, or am I not designing, or is the material designing the solution? So I also felt that if I was going to do that, I needed to somehow do that within a model form and make sure that my process had a kind of equivocal kind of idea about it. So this was, I really limited myself. So I found someone who would supply me these blue gypsum blocks that I'm sure you use here, but they're just not used in the UK. These moisture-resistant blocks, I think they're amazing. We found someone to sponsor, so we got a pile of them. And then we kind of found the right material to emulate the material quality. And I settled very quickly on a building form. And I pushed that building form to its limits. Then, in doing that, this sort of construction on my dining room table, I decided to prop the wobbly corner with a knitting needle, a chopped up knitting needle. And that's sort of resting and propped back by a hagstone from the beach that I talked about earlier, that I go to near my sister's house. So then I introduced the project to a structural engineer. He came into my studio, and we decided very quickly how these pieces would need to be assembled. And he said, well, this is all very good, Mary, but this material will prop it, but the material is very soft, so we're going to have to find something to provide reinforcement at this point. We're going to have to also reinforce the structure at this side, and we're going to do that with a series of timber struts and yokes that would be threaded through the structure. And that was it. So what we did was then kind of split the task down. We found a contractor who'd build the main structure. We engaged a stonemason to build these really beautiful marble pieces. He did that to align with some timber props that a carpenter made. And all of these components were assembled kind of in unison according to a kind of this kind of line of material availability that was sort of hand-picked and selected as we designed a process of which I kind of often described as a sort of mending process. So you allow and push the materials as hard as possible, and then you find the components to mend, to make the structure, to convert the structure into a piece of architecture. So these are a series of images of the boulders being brought in, and they were craned into the site. This is the image of the final piece. And the surface texture, the gypsum is very soft, so you can cut it and carve it. And that's, perhaps I wanted to finish on this because it's kind of, love this idea that somehow this kind of idea about a boulder as a kind of solid material piece found an actual place and facilitated a support for the structure. My mouth is very dry. The next slide is a final thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Mary, for your presentation. Thank you all for being here tonight. The bar is open upstairs. Don't hesitate to go and have a drink discovering the new A+ magazine on sale there. And we hope to see you at our next event shown on the screen. Have a nice evening. Thank you.